Thank you for joining us. I'm proud to present Mr. Gabe Zichermann. Gabe is an entrepreneur, author, public speaker, mentor, and teacher. His 3 books and dozens of workshops on gamification and behavioral design have set the standard in teaching how to build for engagement across many industries and countries. Gabe has co-founded 6 high-tech companies in his career and has always been at the forefront of emerging technologies, such as gaming, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and their interface to human behavior. His latest project, Philosophy, looks closely at why people, companies, and industries fail, and the lessons learned from those who have positively leveraged their mistakes to foster a true culture of innovation. Gabe, the stage is yours.
Hello, everybody. Greetings from wherever you are to wherever you are from where I am, which is Los Angeles. It's very, very nice to be here, and thank you for having me. You know, it's funny when you listen to your own bio, I tend to sound like a very successful person. But actually what I want to talk to you about today is sort of the opposite of that. And June 4th of 2018, 2 years ago, this was basically the worst day of my life. Now, the reason, and you might think, oh, hasn't Corona been worse than that? But no, actually, this was the worst day. And the reason is that on that day, Apple launched this product called Screen Time. And Google had launched their own version of this shortly before. You probably are familiar with it. It's a tool to help you manage your digital usage, you know, what you're doing with your phones and your devices. And that's a noble and important cause, except it competed directly with my startup, which I had been working on for 3 years. It's called Onward. We released all this money, and we're trying to solve this problem. And of course, when Apple enters your market, your business is basically over. And what was challenging about this particular experience, for me immediately thereafter, was I was incredibly embarrassed. I was just, so ashamed, so embarrassed. I had gone on 60 Minutes and been interviewing Anderson Cooper. I'd raised $3.5 million from people that I knew for a long time. I recruited friends from all over the world to come do it, and I was just living incredibly low, really depressed, suicidal, like just not in a really good headspace. And it was something that I felt and believed very passionately about. And then suddenly I had this sort of realization: this is weird that I'm so affected by this failure, because as you heard, I've launched 6 or 7 high-tech startups in my career, depending on how you want to count it. And of those startups, 2 have been successes. The jury's still out on 1 of them, and the rest of them have been colossal failures. They've been huge implosions. I've lost plenty of money. I've made plenty of money. I've lost plenty of money. And so it's kind of weird, because I think, like, okay, 30 years since my first startup until now, and I don't seem to have made any progress in how I deal with failure over that time. Anything I do for 30 years, I'm going to get better at. Literally anything. I'm a better baker today than I was when I was 16. But somehow I'm no better at failure. And that prompted me to sort of ask this semi-rhetorical question, which is that we hear a great deal about how failure is the best teacher. We hear that failure is important, and it's important to fail fast and fail up. And we hear all this advice about, how to just, how to make failure work for you. And there's all the work on grit and resilience in education among students. But what I realized was nobody had ever actually taught me how to fail well. I was supposed to sort of absorb this, I guess, from the universe. And that really did not make sense to me at all in retrospect. So I started looking to understand this phenomenon. Why is it that we say failure is so important, but we don't seem to invest any energy in actually teaching people how to fail well? And, look, I am the child of immigrants. My parents were refugees from communism. My grandparents were all in concentration camps and survived back in Hungary and Romania. And I was a first-generation Canadian. I am actually the eldest in my whole family in our generation. And as many of you can relate, from many different cultural and social vectors in here, being an immigrant, being Jewish, being a child of Holocaust survivors, all this kind of stuff, there's a tremendous amount of pressure to be successful. There is this sort of groundswell of guilt even, that your parents are constantly telling you, like, we sacrificed everything, we gave up everything, we left everything in the middle of the night so that you could have this opportunity, don't squander it. And that's like a ton of pressure to be put under, and especially if you're a precocious child and firstborn, there's a lot going on. And my parents and my grandparents wanted me to have a quality Jewish education and enrolled me from a very early age in Associated Hebrew schools in Toronto, where I grew up. And Associated is a great school, very academically rigorous. And I remember, when I finally left Associated and went to public school, laughing at the fact that public school, they took a whole day to do what we did in half a day's curriculum, right? Because we did the government curriculum in the morning or the afternoon, and then we did the Hebrew curriculum the other side of the day. And so we were cramming everything into half a day and working super hard. And everybody in that school is under pressure. There's the cultural pressure and the teacher pressure and the parents being really intense. In the middle of all of this, what started to happen, or what happened a great deal, was that teachers really had sort of challenging reaction to failure. I remember, raising my hand as a very curious kid, raising my hand in class, and if you made too many mistakes, if you made a couple of wrong guesses in a row, the teacher would say something like, "Hey, if you don't know the answer, don't raise your hand. You're wasting the class's time. We have limited time. You're wasting the time." Now, I know most of you contemporary teachers, modern teachers, certainly when I talk about this subject to parents today, there's usually an audible gasp in the room when I say that, as many people sort of, think about how different that is from the way that kids are educated now, or our belief in it now, and some of the shame or shock or hurt that caused for them in their childhood. And I think on balance, we actually ended up probably pushing, for our children, for my children's generation, we ended up pushing the pendulum too far the other way. So if in my childhood, there was no opportunity of failure. Failure was bad. Failure was embarrassing. Failure was something to be ashamed of. You had to be successful and contribute to your community and take care of your parents and, have children and do all the things that they want you to do. So if in my generation, failure was an unconscionable embarrassment, in this generation, perhaps we've created too many opportunities where kids don't get to fail in the first place. They're structured in such a way that there can be no failure. And I think that pushes the pendulum too far the opposite direction. Of course, we do this, kind of every generation. One generation goes this way, one goes that way. I think we push that too far. And what we really need now is a way of making failure a normal part of the process and improving the way that people, and kids in particular, react to failure, really training them to fail. So training them to take risks and fail, because entrepreneurship is the future of so much of our social change. And of course, there's a bunch of other reasons other than schools that affect our attitude towards success or failure. One of them is kind of startup life. Now that's, my world. And for many of you, like in Israel in particular, you're touched by a ton of startups, probably here in the US and elsewhere as well. And we're sort of taught this narrative that startups are the place where you go to have like kind of great ideas and experiment with things, and everything's cool if you mess up. That if you, lose all your investors' money, no problem, you bounce back, you fail up, you fail often, you fail fast and break things, as Mark Zuckerberg has said. But none of those things really mean anything. And what you realize over time as an entrepreneur in Silicon Valley who's had ups and downs, what people remember is the last thing that you did. So if the last thing that you did is down, you're going to suffer for that, even in high-tech Silicon Valley. So imagine what that's like, for the kids who won't end up in that industry, how challenging, that can actually be. Another reason why we have this problem and why failure is so challenging is a cognitive bias called self-enhancing transmission bias. And that's very wordy. Let me summarize. People who are famous and successful, when they go back and talk about their past histories, they make them sound better than they were. They make them sound like strategic decisions were being made all along that were nonetheless setbacks that serve the greater good. And this is a huge problem. Our culture reflexively adores the famous and successful, but the famous and successful almost never tell the truth about their background. One of my favorite anecdotes about Walt Disney is that there's a few things in none of his official biographies. They're nonetheless true, but they're not in his official biographies. He bankrupted 2 movie studios. He signed terrible deals. Nobody wanted to pick up Mickey Mouse. He had 3 movies that were huge failures that risked the company. And when he wanted to start Disneyland, he actually had to leave the Disney company and start it under a separate business because people didn't believe in him, even though he had already accomplished all of those things at that point. And so one of the interesting details is, these are all facts. These are facts you can find about Walt Disney, but they're not in the default story of Walt Disney. So when we teach success, when we are teaching students how to be more successful in their lives, what we need to teach them is not the success path of those people, because the success path is not true. What we need to do is dig in and find the underlying failures and the resilience that people experience as a result of failure. That is the crucial lesson from the famous. The other problem that we have is a concept called expert bias, which affects another cognitive bias, which affects everyone, including teachers and experts. And that's basically that over time, the more you do a particular activity, the more you study it, the more expert you are at it, the less able you are to reconstruct the process of getting there. So you become unconsciously competent, that is muscle memory. And often we depend on those people with the muscle memory to do the teaching. But those people who have the muscle memory don't remember how the thing was done anymore. So it's incredibly important, I think, as a real tactical thing, if we want to teach kids how to fail well and learn from success, instead of bringing in the most successful entrepreneurs that the most successful coders or the more successful painters or artists or musicians, it's important to bring in people who struggle and who are able to talk about that struggle and talk about the process of getting through that struggle, because that's ultimately what we need to teach. We also use language that pits success and failure against each other as though they're separate states. You noticed at the beginning when I was talking about my bio, I was like, some successes, some failures. But this isn't true. And people who experiment a lot, people who are very pro-risk and very successful, when they're actually pressed, what they often will tell you is that success and failure, they're not opposite states, they're coexisting states. That at all times when you're dealing with a success, you're also worried that you're dealing with a failure. And all the times that you're dealing with a failure in your mind, you're also dealing with success. And this voice, this self-critical voice that's often called the Gremlin or a self-judgment or just your internal critic, that critical voice is often set in childhood, and it's about avoiding failure, about avoiding embarrassment, about avoiding those kinds of situations. And that can be very difficult for people if we need and want them to be very entrepreneurial and very pro-risk. Now, some organizations are handling things differently. Things are starting to change in the business community at large, and this has implications for teachers, of course. One of them is at Netflix, where the company likes to manage their failure rates, or the number of shows they have to cancel every year, which is called the cancellation rate. They like to manage that number up, not down, which is very counterintuitive. But Netflix's founder has said that if they don't create enough things that need to be canceled, they are not risking enough. And I think this is important because we're going to see more and more companies do it that way. Many organizations are also doing what's called Dare to Try, where people who have a failure, but a well-intentioned failure, are rewarded alongside the people who've had success and a big success. And that's important to create some parity between those two because of the need to counter program against this fear of failure. And that's not give everybody a badge, right? It's really to recognize the best effort and the best outcome at the same time. And the last piece, which is very important to teach, is a concept called portfolio theory. And I don't really have time to go into all of it right now, but let me use my version of it. I call it pugfolio theory. And basically the premise is, like a venture capitalist has 10 companies to invest in. She expects that of those 10 companies, 6 will return no money, 3 will kind of move sideways, never really return anything, and 1 will be a huge success, a best in show. And that one investment returns for the whole portfolio. Professional investors understand that the way to improve the quality of your portfolio is not to move the failures into the next column and then into the next column. Because if you do that, if you focus on the failure, you'll reduce the risk profile of your portfolio and actually make it less successful overall, reduce your return. What you need to do is, as quickly as possible, cycle through those that aren't going to return and make your investments in the ones that are. And so that, for us, as we teach our children and we think about the future of this conversation, that means to look at success or failure for a longer time horizon Understand that the investments that you make at each stage provide opportunity for, for growth. And I want to leave you with this one parting thought, which is a thought that I think about a lot and I think is important also for us to teach, which is if you're not on the precipice of failure right now, meaning if you're not in your life right now looking at a failure that could possibly befall a project, you're probably not pushing yourself hard enough. You're probably not doing something that's really meaningful and important. Because one of the greatest lessons that I've learned about all of this is that your fear of failure, that anxiety, the butterflies in your stomach that you get when you're worried about being embarrassed or failing, that's not something to avoid. That's not a feeling to run away from. Because what that feeling is an indicator that you're doing something that's important enough to you that you care about the outcome. And so if there's one idea that I can leave you all with, and I'm very happy to talk with you, at length, my social media profile, my email's up there, reach out to me, I'd love to talk to you. That one concept, if there's no one thing that you take away from this, it's time for us to teach our kids how to embrace failure.
Thank you, Gabe. That was fascinating.
Thanks,
we hope you all stay with us for the next session on the art of successful education videos.